Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Ambassador, thanks for being here. Let me start. I would be remiss without first thanking you, and I've even written you a letter in which you responded very quickly, by the way, for I think in the administration, nobody has been more forthcoming on support and solidarity with those who are struggling for freedom around the world. You've done so repeatedly on social media, which is crucial. Whether it was, for example, during the CELAC issue in Cuba, or the students in Venezuela who are trying to recapture the democracy, you have been exceedingly forthright. And for that, as I did so in writing, I want to publicly do so now. Thank you for that. Really, three issues I'm going to throw out really quickly. Let me just do that really quickly, and then you could respond. In March, a UN panel of experts provided a report to the UN Security Council concluding that the July illegal shipment of weapons to North Korea from Cuba, in fact, violated sanctions and constituted, by the way, the largest amount of weapons interdicted going to North Korea since the adoption of the Resolution 1718 in 2006. I don't have to talk about all the details about that. They were clearly trying to hide it. So given the discovery of that of Cuba and North Korea's regime willful, frankly, collusion to violate UN sanctions, what action is underway to hold those two regimes responsible for obviously violating U.S. sanctions? Point number one. If I can then jump to Venezuela, where again, like you have been in Cuba, you have been very vocal. Very, very vocal. And by the way, you cannot underestimate the importance of those statements that you've been making on Twitter for those who are repressed and oppressed. That's a huge deal. I don't have to tell you about what's going on in Venezuela. You're very familiar. But what is the administration, or what can or are you doing specifically through the United Nations to bring attention to frankly, the horrible situation in Venezuela, where students are being arrested, where frankly, one of the main opposition leaders has been in prison for over a month, and all of the human rights violations in Venezuela. And again, I encourage you, and I know you will continue to do your part publicly, but what is the UN looking at that, and what can be done there? And lastly, to a fiscal issue that you talked about, and I think I still have a little time, specifically concerning the issue of the peacekeeping funds. So the President's budget request is more than $800 million for peacekeeping and a new peacekeeping contingency account. Now, the concern is that the assessed rate for the United States continues to rise above what is frankly authorized by U.S. law. So then meanwhile, the UN approves new and expanded peacekeeping missions that are frankly very costly. And then we don't see a lot of reductions or proposals for the elimination or reduction of missions that have been around for decades, for example, such as the one in Western Sahara. So there, what is the administration doing to reduce or to eliminate, hopefully, outdated UN peacekeeping missions? Why should this committee support a contingency fund when there is very little, frankly, if any, discipline being shown in budgeting for those peacekeeping missions, current peacekeeping missions? And what is being done to help bring, again, a resolution to some of those, specifically, for example, like the Western Sahara? So, Ambassador, I know I threw a bunch of issues out there. I apologize for that. But we have a very strict chairwoman, and so we try to be very cooperative with her. Exactly. I know my place, Madam Chairwoman.
Given how important each of the questions are, I'm very nervous about the 54 seconds I have left to answer them all. So I hope the chairwoman would give me just a little bit of indulgence so I can at least seek to do some justice. I suspect the issue of the fiscal climate and the peacekeeping funds will come up and will be raised by other members, so maybe I can elaborate in greater detail. Let me start with that, if I could. You rightly note that the peacekeeping requests that we are making, or the peacekeeping funds we are asking for, we're asking for more this year than we did last year. That is owing to a couple key issues. The first is Mali last year occurred after our regular budget cycle. By Mali, I mean the takeover of 2/3 of the country by violent extremists. And as a result, part of what we're asking for here is funding to make up for a mission that was authorized outside the regular budget cycle. But the other reason is that South Sudan, tragically, devastatingly, has degenerated into a horrible ethnic conflict just since December of this year, and we've had to expand the number of peacekeepers in South Sudan. In addition, although it's not actually reflected in the President's budget request because this has just come on, we are going to be requesting funding, as the Chairwoman indicated in her opening statement, for the Central African Republic for a peacekeeping mission there in all likelihood, and this is something we're just beginning to consult with you all on. And again, at some point I hope I'll have a chance to speak to the devastation of what's happening there. But you're right, it's not enough to simply say the real world is presenting these emergencies and we have to respond to them because we live in a fiscally challenged climate. And so what we have done over the course of the last 5 years, and I was actively involved in this when I was working at the White House as the President's UN advisor, we have brought down the costs per peacekeeper. The cost now is 16% lower than it was when we started seeking costs. So again, the pie is bigger because the real world emergencies, you only have to read the newspaper to see that the world is presenting successive challenges to us. But per peacekeeper, we are bringing down the cost, and that has involved eliminating duplication. Again, I won't go into the details here, but I hope we'll have a chance to elaborate on some of the measures that we have taken. We just last week closed down the mission in Sierra Leone. In my opening statement, you heard me say that these peacekeeping missions, many of them we find essential, but they need not be eternal. And I think there is a habit, sort of once a mission gets set up, to not be sufficiently assessing the original reason that the Congress and the U.S. Came to support a mission, and assessing whether that mission is appropriately configured given the evolution of circumstances on the ground. There are reductions happening, but in a responsible way in Haiti, Liberia, Ivory Coast, I think where tremendous gains have been made. And again, I could speak more to that. On Venezuela, we have a responsibility, of course, as the United States, to speak up on behalf of those who are seeking their freedom. And I really appreciate the tremendous leadership you've shown always in standing up to repressive regimes. I think nearly 40 people have been killed in these protests, these peaceful protests, where people are airing their legitimate aspirations and their legitimate grievances. You mentioned the criminalization of dissent. That is something, again, we have been outspoken about. We have called for a third party to get involved in mediation in some fashion because it's in everybody's interest for this crisis to end. But that third party mediator needs to be credible to both sides, and that until recently had been a sticking point, but a little progress I think has been made on the mediation. At the UN, at the Human Rights Council, we issued a joint statement on Venezuela, enlisted a number of countries to join us. It will not surprise you that given that the UN is filled, more than half of UN member states are non-democratic, it is not always easy for us to pull together the kind of coalition of the willing, shall we say, within the UN, a cross-regional coalition. But that is what we seek to do. We seek, even if we can't get overwhelming vote counts, we seek to create kind of alignments of people who share the same democratic values speaking out on behalf of Venezuela. I would welcome any ideas you have about further steps that we can take within the UN system and agree that it's incredibly important to raise it there and to multilateralize the human rights concerns that are at the heart, meant to be at the heart of the UN Charter. Lastly, if I could, just on the DPRK and Cuba sanctions violations, there are sort of a lot of very bureaucratic things I can say about the things we're doing at the UN on this particular case. It was the largest arms seizure. We are very grateful and thank Panama for stepping up and meeting its responsibilities as it is doing in a remarkable way, really across a whole host of issues, including Venezuela. We have, through the Sanctions Committee, sought to issue a public implementation assistance notice to share lessons learned with member states and correct Cuba's claims about how they're interpreting the UNSCRs, and the report that came back was very strong. It basically rejected the Cuban arguments, which we thought was very important, again, and given that UN reporting can sometimes be uneven, is important to stress. We are seeking to impose sanctions on entities we can prove are responsible for the violation. This is challenging because UN sanctions, of course, come by consensus, and so we will need to get China, Russia, and other members of the Security Council to come along board, but that is a work in progress. And we are seeking to release publicly the panel of experts incident report, which again we think rejects frontally Cuban and North Korean claims on this issue. Thank you, Madam Chair.